Everyone, I'm Michael Moore with Merlin Law Group. Today's session is about protecting client outcomes and major property losses. Small early decisions can make or break recovery. If you take anything from today's webinar, it's that you need to preserve privilege and client trust. Early control defines claim value. And if you're ever in doubt, call Merlin Law Group. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Start off with Dan Veroff. He's an attorney out of our San Francisco, California office. He is licensed in Oregon, Washington, and California. He has co-counseled matters in Colorado, Nevada, Florida, and other states. He has practiced insurance law his entire legal career. Outside of the firm, Dan is on the board of directors for United Policyholders, which is an absolutely amazing organization helping policyholders. Next up is Derek Chaiken. He heads up our Los Angeles office. Derek is licensed to practice law in all of the state and federal courts in California. Derek is also general counsel of PCAPIA, Pacific Coast Association of Public Insurance Adjuster. That's another amazing group that helps policyholders. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Bowers. He's Executive Vice President of Fire Test Pro. He's one of the premier industrial hygienists in the nation. He has personally conducted over 800 fire losses, ranging from complex commercial fires to catastrophic wildland urban events. And we're lucky to have him on today. Gentlemen, I know you're all really busy, so let's get started. Policy landmines. Let's see. Policy landmines. Derek, which policy clauses quietly shift risk to the client, and how do you reframe them for leverage? You have that right.
Derek's muted.
Derek, you muted.
Thanks, Michael. Before we kind of get into policy landmines, I think we should kind of discuss some early things that go on right when a claim or a loss event occurs that really are very important to policyholders to make sure they know what's going on, and of course their counsel as well. Of course, the best preparation for a claim is making sure you understand your policy and that you have the right policy. A lot of the things that we're discovering after catastrophic losses, like the ones we handle normally at Merlin, whether it's hurricanes, wildfires, or any real property loss, is we really see that people don't have the right policy. And that starts way before a claim occurs or a loss occurs. And that's really working with brokers. A lot of attorneys receive questions from their client about, hey, do I have the right coverage? And really, it's a really nuanced question. They got to make sure they're working with the right brokers to make sure they have the right policies to really cover them. Of course, when you prepare for a catastrophe, usually we know when a hurricane's on the way. Sometimes we know when a wildfire is on the way. And a lot of advice was to videotape what you have in your home and what your home looks like if you haven't documented it in some way. We have a lot of challenges with people saying, well, I don't know what kind of floor I had. I just don't remember. And we say, well, now you got to go back and pull from family photos. See what you have in your phone. See what you actually documented. So the most important thing to be is be prepared prior to a loss to know exactly what you have. Make sure you have the right coverages. And then, of course, once a loss event occurs, a loss-inducing event occurs, is to continue documenting everything. Continue trying to take those pictures. I wouldn't advise people to put themselves in an unsafe place, but a lot of people after the Southern California wildfires were going back to their homes on December 8th, December 9th, while things were still burning. And they were able to take those videos and narrate those videos of where they were, what they were seeing, because their neighborhoods don't look the same anymore. And so really being able to provide the context of what they're looking at really helps. So I would just document everything. On the same hand is making sure you save all your receipts. I would be advising clients you don't have to wait for permission from an insurance company to get a hotel. A lot of people think, oh, I need permission to do this. As long as it's a reasonable expense and you're not spending more than what you think you should be doing, it will be covered under California law, at least, under California law for the most part, for hotels, meals, clothing if you don't have any, toiletries, pet boarding, mileage. just making sure you save the receipts to document what you've actually lost and how to make the claim for it. We have a lot of very important laws that are created in California, recent laws that carriers aren't always so familiar with. Advances on additional living expense, advances on contents claims if you have an unfortunate position of having a total loss. But again, making sure you document what you've been spending is really helpful as well. Another thing that sometimes people overlook, and they will go to counsel or they'll go to their broker, is making sure you actually report the claim. You can't assume your insurance company knows what's going on with your property just because it's on the news. You actually have to report the claim. But I want to just, the caveat is, if you're reporting for a client, is to keep it simple. We have a lot of issues, and Dan and Jonathan will talk about the impacts of smoke claims. But right now, my advice to clients, if you were impacted by a loss, is I was impacted by a wildfire, my home was. I'm reporting wildfire damage to my home. Please assign an adjuster. That's all you need to do. There'll be, of course, follow-up questions from the adjuster, or at least the first notice of loss team. You're going to make sure you do that. Another really important thing that people always kind of forget is, if your home is still there, is some mitigation work, securing your property from further damage. In a wildfire context, that could be boarding up your home, tarping your home, turning off gas if the utilities weren't turned off. And the same kind of advice can be used to, water claims, making sure the water's turned off to the property. Sometimes it's just not instinctual for a lot of people to do that, or they just don't know how to do it. Other things to kind of, help strengthen your claim would be to not really disturb the evidence. I wouldn't be throwing stuff away just because it's dirty. Sometimes your best evidence is right in front of you and you just don't know, but really it's evidence at that point. It's evidence is part of your claim. And as we're learning in California on smoke claims, that's your evidence at the time of trial. Even ruined items, again, things that you're never going to use again, an insurance company may want to inspect. And if you get rid of these things or start cleaning things, an insurance company could claim that you've prejudiced their ability to inspect a property. So just make sure you don't throw anything away and don't start cleaning. And finally, of course, again, kind of going along with that pre-loss instruction of videoing what you have, try to just make a general idea of your contents list. Again, you could do that at home, just taking pictures if your house is still there. And then, figure out exactly what you own. If there's something that is, you have specialized policies for collectibles, making sure you document exactly what you have, depending on the type of policy. One final thing that I think is always kind of really important is asking your insurance company for a complete copy of your policy. California law and other states also hold the same thing, that when you have a loss, your insurance company is required to provide you a complete copy of your policy if you ask for it. A lot of people will say, I got my policy, and they'll send you their policy and it's just a declarations page. Well, that's nice and all, but it doesn't include any of the California endorsements, or any endorsements to the policy, or any of the specific California law that might be required, or really anywhere. It doesn't really matter. It has to be California. You want to make sure if there's any specific forms your insurance company requires, to ask for that as well. And of course, getting your adjuster's contact information is really important to make sure you're communicating with the right person. And of course, if you think you need help with this, hire help early. A lot of claims, not wildfire claims, but a lot of claims are ruined right away when an insured doesn't know exactly what they're reporting to the insurance company. As just the biggest example I ever hear is, I had a sewage backup. Whenever someone says sewage backup, I always think the city's sewer main backed up into their home. I'm saying, no, it's a toilet clog. The big difference in the way words are used. So just make sure you're really careful with how you report information. And if you need help on how to report, of course, contact a professional on how to do it.
Thank you, Derek. Next up, early client concerns. Dan, what are a few early indicators that the claim may need additional help? Dan, you're on mute.
Thanks, Michael. Yep, just getting my unmute there. Well, so look, if you have a claim that involves something you need emergency services for, then of course you're going to be expecting immediate response from the insurance company or taking immediate action. If you have a loss you're dealing with that doesn't have emergency services, you're going to want to get used to the fact that you're not going to see the insurance company acting as quickly as you expect them to do so, based on how they've advertised to you and promised to you. But insurance companies are guided in their deadlines by the California regulations, and you will often see insurance companies taking all the maximum amount of time they have to respond to communications, which is 15 days. Seems like a ton. But when you're paying attention to those regulatory deadlines and you see the insurance company delaying, not being responsive, that's when you start wanting to get a little bit worried. If you see the insurance company switching adjusters on your claim constantly before they have a chance to even really get something together, then that's a very important sign that you may need extra help. If the person for the insurance company or on its behalf who comes to inspect doesn't talk to you really, doesn't ask you a lot of questions, they say they don't have authority to do this, that, or the other, right? You should start getting concerned. If they have consultants who come out and inspect and they don't share their reports with you, or you get an estimate for the repair costs and dozens of line items for repair types are listed as pending or open or further investigation, and the insurance company is just encouraging you to start work, right? Of course, if you get a denial letter saying, hey, this type of loss or this type of property is not covered, or if you get a reservation of rights that says, hey, we're investigating whether this was a slow leak that's not covered, that's a critical time to get a lawyer involved, especially when you need extra help, because that's a legal issue. Of course, also when the insurer is lowballing you, they're using software, they're having an adjuster write your estimate. You have a contractor who's telling you how much it could be. You have a second contractor, right? And the insurance company is trying to negotiate with them behind your back or cut their corners. All of these things are signs that your claim isn't being adjusted well, and you should be bringing in extra help.
Thank you, Dan. Now we get to policy landmines, which I was on earlier. Derek, which policy clauses quietly shift risk to the client, and how do you reframe them for leverage?
Sure. I always tell clients, it's your claim, and you call it a claim. But what's the insurance company call it? They call it a loss. They're losing money, and that's why they call it a loss, and that's why the claim is yours. And the burden, evidentiary to push a claim forward, is on the insured to present their claim and their damages. What happens is once you've presented your claim and the damages, carriers often try to then switch back the obligation to, or at least keep the obligation on the insured to present information and do their own investigation. That's simply unfair. That's against pretty much every insurance law in the country, and including California, where insurance companies have the obligation to investigate claims at their own expenses. So what we see a lot, especially in commercial policies or kind of, not so big carriers that use ISO forms, which is insurance service offices forms, is a lot of language that may conflict with the law of the state that the policy is issued in. A good example is in California, we follow what's known as efficient proximate cause. And that's a doctrine under the insurance code. And it basically says when you have a covered peril and an excluded peril, the courts are designated to look at what was the efficient proximate cause of the loss. So what actually set this in motion? As the best example I can give is a mudslide after a wildfire. So as long as that mudslide's within general proximity to the wildfire, it was the wildfire that set in motion the loosening of the ground and loosening of the soils. The rain after it only caused the earth movement. So what actually was the efficient proximate cause? And our Department of Insurance has stepped in and said, no, that's caused by the wildfire. That's the efficient proximate cause. So when you have two competing causes of loss, you're designated to follow you're designated to follow California law. Another one we see a lot of, and there's a lot of, anti-concurrent causation laws that we'll see in these policies that just don't apply when you look at it under the law of the state that you're in. A second kind of main issue that I always see is when carriers try to use language to try to get out of paying for matching regulations. So a lot of states have matching regulations where if something's not damaged in one area of a property, but damaged in another. For example, continuous flooring. If you have the same flooring in one area and you replace it in one area, but not another area, the obligation of the carrier is to bring that property back to a pre-loss condition. In California, we call it providing for reasonably uniform appearance in the damaged area. And this puts a lot of claims like this in the gray and makes it so, there is a lot of work on behalf of contractors to say, hey, we can match these cabinets. We can match these, upper and lower cabinets. And that really falls under California law and other jurisdictions holding that you can actually do that. So those are kind of common pitfalls that carriers use to try to get out of paying for claims by ignoring state law.
Thanks, Derek. Next up, appraisal versus litigation. Derek, what is the difference and why is litigation better earlier? And Derek's going to speak on appraisal.
Sure. So appraisal is a process. Usually it's a contractual agreement within a policy that allows you as an insured, or an insurer can use appraisal as well, to resolve disputes involving the value of a loss. It's not designed to determine coverage. Though some courts recently have determined that coverage could come up in appraisal. Appraisal is an informal process. It does follow arbitration rules in a lot of states, but it is also governed by the policy's appraisal provision and the state law that you're in. So you're not filing a lawsuit. You are invoking appraisal, and each policy has its own unique steps on how to invoke appraisal. Usually what we do in appraisal is you're creating a 3-person panel, someone that represents the insured, someone that represents the insurance company, and a neutral umpire that kind of oversees the process in the case of disputes. So in a traditional appraisal process, each of those appraisers should be working together to try to figure out the value of the damaged item. For example, if it's a piece of painted drywall and the carrier says, we believe this is, we think it costs $50 to paint this wall. And the insured says, no, I have a quote for $100. An appraisal panel can kind of bridge the gap and find what actually is the right price to pay for that. So it's kind of an informal process, and the panel can set its own procedures. And awards are written out by the court. So appraisal is usually a faster process than litigation. Sometimes not, because there are still hearings and there still can be witnesses that are presented. At the same time, you're just figuring out contractual valuation. Often people bring us a appraisal award and say, look, I got $1 million appraisal award. But there's a bunch of caveats and asterisks on there that says, well, this is if there is coverage for this loss. And that requires litigation. So obviously litigation is lawsuits filed in court, where you kind of don't value yourself to the same provisions of appraisal. Appraisal, you're following a contractual valuation process, versus litigation, you're following what the court requirements are. And so those litigation procedures can vary greatly just depending on the type of case you have.
Thanks, Derek. Dan, why is litigation better earlier?
Thanks, Michael. Litigation. So if you have made the decision, or if you've received the recommendation that it's better to go to litigation than appraisal, which you're going to hear from us if you ask us, it is in most cases. It is better to go early. So, like any case, you have a short checklist of things you have to prove to prevail. And in these cases, right, you're going to want to make sure you have a check in all those boxes. And that's true for bad faith, right? Now, once you have the insurance company saying, no, we're not going to do this, and you've presented them the information and support, what's the point in just begging them, engaging in a letter writing campaign for weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months, you have what you need from the insurance company banked. These insurance companies are used to standing on their position for a long period of time. And you're going to see the same kind of delays and the same kind of frustrations often when you get into litigation. And just get the case going, right? Bank the no's, bank the denials, take a shot at getting them reconsidered, and then get into litigation. Because look, if you file a lawsuit and the court assigns you a trial date, and that's a year or a year and a half from the day you filed the lawsuit, guess what? That's considered not too bad, okay? The courts are very backed up. And the trial date is your ultimate pressure. But let's face it, right? Insurance companies know from experience that if they employ a cost-effective approach to their claims handling, that shortchanges a lot of folks, and a lot of folks get caught up in the cracks and don't get their issues addressed. A big portion of those folks are just going to go away. They're not going to fight for it. And then of the folks who fight, only a small portion will probably retain the right attorneys, who will only know how to handle it the right way. And then when you're in this potentially long litigation process where you have a lot of rights, but once you're in it, it's kind of a war of attrition. How long is your client going to hold out, right? And so really, you want to make sure you're in contact with potential attorneys early when you're seeing the yellow flags. And if the advice is, look, you've got enough what you need, right? Let's stop just begging and pleading. Get to litigation, because then you're most dangerous to the insurance company. You've proven to them that you're not one of the majority of folks who are going to walk away. And too often when you're in the adjustment process and you're doing things to try to get your claim paid, you might just have to accept that you're not doing those to actually get them paid. You're doing those to set up an attorney for success later. Because when we have large, complex claims, unfortunately, you just only get so far in the claims adjustment process in a majority, or a big portion at least, of these situations.
Thanks, Dan. Next up, reaching true replacement costs. We'll stick with Dan on this. How do you build defensible valuations for complex systems and finishes?
Thanks, Michael. So again, we're here, we're talking about large losses, right? We're not here, giving advice about small, easy to handle claims. We're talking about situations where maybe legal counsel is going to be involved, right? And so we're talking about where there's a lot of money at stake. And really, you want to work up these claims correctly and professionally. And it may cost you money, okay? But the value you're going to get from working up a claim through the right professional consultant, let's say you have a structural engineering issue, hire a forensic structural engineer whose job it is to assess a building in its condition and write a really detailed, persuasive report on that subject, right? Don't necessarily hire a structural engineer who's out there working every day, but doesn't know how to make a report, a presentation that's going to get your claim settled. So yeah, it's finding extra people. It's extra money. It can be expensive, but you really need to do it. And we've got Jonathan Bowers here who's going to talk to you in a little bit. And Jonathan is one of those types of people. He's an environmental hygienist, and his specialty, he'll go over that with you. But, look, you can do it cheaper than Jonathan does it. He's still very affordable. Don't want to, say that, Jonathan, but you can do it cheaper. You can do it faster. But is it really going to get you as far, right? So you can't count on the insurance company to build the claim for you, right? Like Derek said, to them, it's a loss, and they're going to try to minimize their loss. And that's how they're going to build it, right? If you want to build it to maximize what you're entitled to, and to do it in a way where you get money so you can control the repairs and not deal with an insurance company's vendor, things like that. Sorry, I'm getting some odd beeping here. But anyway, right, you want to really put together a professional, well-supported claim that's documented, and you want to make sure it's really tight and that you're not overreaching either. So just one quick last note, like on the specialty systems thing. If you have, an advanced speaker system in the home, get that company out to come out and assess it, right? If you have really high-end appliances, and let's say you have a smoke damage claim and you're worried about them being affected, get those companies to come out, right? Hire specialists, comprehensive, well-supported claim, get it in soon and defend it. That's the best way to reach true replacement cost and without it taking longer than it should.
Thanks, Dan. Next up, changing the narrative. Derek, if you can share one example of success, how you've worked with personal attorneys. You're on mute, Dan.
Derek.
Excuse me, Derek, sorry.
How do I pick one? No, look, I pride myself in taking on some pretty complex claims over the last couple of years. I'm talking about really a lot of challenges, not just on residential claims where we have bizarre contents. I'm in Los Angeles. We have wild contents claims, items that appreciate, don't depreciate, that are covered without having, special endorsements or riders on the policy, without having schedulized policies. I have a massive cases involving high-end art. And Dan just kind of pointed at something. Look, have the artists themselves come out and say, if it's worth it, of course, say what's going on with this piece. Why is this piece affected by, for example, the wildfire? Why is it yellowed? Why is this staining? And it really is important to make sure you get not just anyone to make an opinion, but the right person to make an opinion. Because there's a lot of carriers, insurance companies are specialists in finding, for on electronics, for example, they'll hire a company called, I've seen this company called Strike Check everywhere. They go and plug stuff in. They say, yep, it works. But they don't actually look at what's on the components, on the electrical wires. Recently, I had a client in the e-cigarette industry, and it was a horribly challenging claim because they had a total fire loss where the entire warehouse was gone. They did not maintain an off-cloud perpetual inventory system, and so we were left with basically putting together emails and invoices to figure out exactly what was going on at the property at the time of the loss. I was fortunate enough to work with and select for my client a great team of experts to put forward a bunch of forensic accounting documents that were irrefutable by the carrier. And we were able to basically take a doomed claim into getting over an 8-figure appraisal award against the carrier, and ended up with a judgment against the insurance company as well, recognizing that they should have actually been participating in the investigation themselves and not put it all on the insured. So there's, I think it's a really good example that when things do get complicated, reach out to experts and make sure that you understand exactly what you're fighting for, because valuing commercial losses, valuing complicated content losses is really what matters most to your clients, is to figure out, hey, you should know exactly what I have. It's not always that straightforward, depending where you are and how things are calculated. Even across the country, we have different ways of calculating valuations. So just make sure you work with the right team and selecting those right experts to get going for you.
Thanks, Derek. Dan, can you share an example of success?
Absolutely, yeah. So examples of working with personal attorneys. For example, we are just finishing up a case of a strip hotel in Las Vegas, and it's don't worry, it's not one of the major ones. It's one of the older ones, but they had a big loss, and we were working through the client's personal attorney, and I'm convinced this attorney had, basically like 1 or 2 clients for the past 30 years. And one of them is this group of a couple guys, right, who deal with these investments. And he had his own challenges on dealing with how tough his client was. He had his own challenge on getting their attention for time-sensitive issues on these matters. And it was really important to work hand in hand with him and to really make sure that he could communicate things to his clients in ways that would make sense to his clients from their business perspective. And he was really good at speaking with them for what they need to hear to sort of, for their overall business, and was able to sort of contextualize the issues that we're hyper-focused on for the insurance claim so his clients can understand them. And there were so many competing factors here. We wanted to repair the hotel and get it back in service. But at the same time, there made a lot of sense to demo it and demo a couple buildings around it and to rebuild a brand new MGM or something like that in that space where they owned that entire block of the city on the Strip. And being able to have someone who is familiar with what their client wants, their overall goals, and sort of how to take things that we need to frame in certain ways for the case and have them translate so the client could understand it. It was so helpful to have them there. They were the type of clients where if we accidentally had a call with them without the personal attorney on, frankly, we didn't speak their language exactly as well. And, we were sort of outside hired hand, right? We weren't within the inner circle of trust as much. But getting through that really tough case with a few really tight lines to walk, it was 100% credited to us really maximizing that personal attorney and making sure that really the client heard things the way they needed to hear them to make sense so we could get the client to sign off on the things we needed to do.
Thank you, Dan and Derek. There's some great examples. Now we move on to one of the most important part of the webinar, the fire segment. Independent origin and cause. Jonathan, why should clients retain their own expert immediately?
Mike, that's a great question, and it's got a bifurcated answer to it. When you have a loss of any kind, but especially a fire loss, there are a couple of reasons why you want to get an expert in on the front side. And that could be an industrial hygienist, or as Derek alluded to earlier, a structural engineer, or maybe a building consultant. Identifying not only what happened to the property, but also the environmental or structural potential damages that anybody who's performing emergency services on that structure, what they might be exposed to. You need to identify those from the onset. There are OSHA standards that need to be adhered to for anybody who's working on the property. There are EPA standards that need to be adhered to for any kind of abatement or remediation processes in some instances. So bringing somebody in on the front side of the loss is essential to protect the workers who are going to be working on that property, firstly and foremostly, but then also to document what actually happened as a result of the claim peril that happened that you're there to attend to. And these conditions, especially whether it's wildfire or a structure fire, there's a lot of similarities between the two, but there are also nuanced variances between them as well. But the condition of the property changes over time. And I recommend getting somebody out there as quickly as possible to memorialize the loss, document it through photographs and testing, or taking measurements of the affected materials so that you can put it into the scope of the loss when you go to file your demand.
Wow. Also, let's get next to hidden damage you can't see. Jonathan, what hidden damage drives future failures and how to document it?
There are a lot of hidden damages with fires. I'll start with structure fires. We've had multiple commercial losses throughout the United States, whether it's been on hotels or assisted living facilities or restaurants, where the fire was localized in one area of the property, and the carrier came in and said, well, we're just going to clean up this area over here. But what they didn't take into consideration was that when a fire happens inside the structure, it pressurizes the structure and it forces air. So pressure wants to equilibrate. So it wants to equilibrate the pressure throughout the structure. And what it does is it pushes that smoke in through all the wall cavities or into any kind of open areas, whether drop ceilings or interstitial spaces within the area. And when that smoke settles, once the pressurization is dropped, that will remain there until perpetuity, until it's actually mitigated. So most of the material that is a byproduct of a structure fire or even an urban wildfire is caustic material. It's very corrosive. And when it comes into contact with certain different types of materials like metals or glass, it will corrode or deteriorate that metal over time, where you may not realize that that let's call it an HVAC system. That HVAC system, or maybe a chiller unit on a building, has been affected by this corrosive material. It will more than likely function for a certain period of time, maybe a year, maybe 24 months, but because of the consistent exposure to that corrosive material, it'll eventually deteriorate, fail to conduct electricity, begin to short out. And when something begins to short out, it becomes a new fire hazard. So you have to have the appropriate professionals evaluate these types of mechanical systems during the analysis and discovery phase of a loss. But the consistent exposure to porous materials, you guys were talking just before this about some wins that you had in changing the narrative. We had a restaurant in Scottsdale, Arizona that had a minor kitchen fire, but because of some of the materials that burned inside the kitchen, the carrier didn't do any analysis on that. And then when they wanted to initially give out $145,000 to fix the kitchen and put everything back together again and go on with it. But after our testing was involved and we demonstrated a dispersion pattern that infected the entire building, contaminated all the benches and all the seating in the restaurant and bar area, they had to get new furniture for the entire place. They had to bring the exterior walls down to the steel framing members to decontaminate the walls. That wound up turning into like a $1.9 million loss for them because of the evaluation that not only myself, but a structural engineer performed on the property.
Thank you.
So
how do you know which items in a fire damaged home can be clean and what needs to be thrown out? And also, how do you prove that?
That's another great question. This gets into an area where I believe that type of loss involves multiple disciplines. So you need an industrial hygienist to come in and quantify what kind of environmental exposures happen to that particular material. Now, certain elements, certain items within the home, like insulation, there's no way to clean insulation. You can definitely go on record and say that that's got to get tossed. But when it comes to different types of porous materials, as Derek was talking about earlier, you may have something that's a high-end piece of property, right? Let's just call it an antique Persian rug. I've got a client who's got a $250,000 antique rug. I know a guy in Colorado who is an expert at restoring those. The cost to restore it is going to be approximately $70,000, but it's worth, and he will guarantee the efficacy of the restoration. It's worth going down that road because the likelihood of finding a like kind and quality or an exact kind and quality for that rug is slim to none. So we're going to give Sean the opportunity to go ahead and decontaminate that. And he's done that several times before with other fires, Lahaina, the Marshall fire, the Woolsey fire, but other elements in the home. Cost to repair or restore versus cost to replace is a huge consideration that needs to be analyzed when you're doing personal property inventory. But then there are certain elements where when you expose property, porous property to mercury or lithium, you're never going to find a restorer that's going to guarantee that they're going to salvage it. And the toxicity levels of exposure to those types of elements are extreme as well. So, but with most personal property, porous personal property anyway, you want to get a qualified contents restorer in there who has done a high level of, in many different cases of contents restoration on smoke contamination, because your average person who just comes in and does a lot of water or mold remediation, they usually don't have the experience or the credentials to be able to decontaminate some of the finer items out there. The piece of art that Derek was talking about before, you can send that into a laboratory for TEM analysis to actually non-invasively investigate that canvas to determine whether or not it's been contaminated. And there's a variety of different ways, but the point is get the proper experts on your side to allow for that investigation to happen.
Thanks, Jonathan. Some great points. We're now going to get into the question and answer period. And right now we have a question. Why do you think that the public health folks do not require pre-mitigation testing in these urban conflagrations? They seem absent here. Can somebody take that?
Well, I think that's probably a really great question for Jonathan, to be honest. My 2 cents as a policyholder attorney is somewhat limited on it. I would love to see it. I can say that, as many of you probably know, California's Department of Insurance impaneled a smoke task force to try to identify some standards. And the California Department of Health has representation on that panel, and I've seen a presentation that they've provided from the public health perspective. And what they presented seemed to be mostly in favor of testing, but also in favor of drawing presumptions, maybe even without testing. So that's what I've seen so far. I'm not sure what LA County is doing. But like I said, I'm sure Jonathan's got some good insight, or at least better than us.
Well, you've got really good points there, Dan. And, I'd like to add to that I think there are a couple of reasons why the carriers prefer not to do any pre-remediation testing. And over the years, I've heard this as a reason that's come out of their camp multiple times. Well, it's obviously visibly damaged. Why do we need to test it? We know that it's soot contaminated or char contaminated. Well, science has evolved tremendously over the last 5 years with regards to this type of a loss. And the reason why you want to have the testing done on the front side is so you can efficiently scope the abatement or restoration plan to account for any kind of contaminations that might not be considered off of an visual investigation. And of course, when that scope expands, so does the cost to repair the loss, right? So I think those are probably your 2 biggest reasons. It's mostly monetary driven.
Thanks, Jonathan. Got another question. Derek, if you can help with this one. When a carrier suggests appraisal, what's the simplest way for a non-property attorney to spot when that might hurt their client instead of help?
So, it's funny. For a long time, we'd always see carriers being the ones that were compelling appraisal, because really they want to lock the insured in on what the scope of damages are and try to limit it to just things that they agree to pay for. And there might not be a way to avoid it. There may be a way to work with the appraisal panel to price items that might not be included in the scope. That's usually the case. Is, for example, we're looking at a house. This bathroom is just not. The client insists the bathroom should be part of the loss, and carrier says, "Nope, we're not paying for it. We're going to go to appraisal." You can actually use litigation and appraisal at the same time. You can litigate the coverage issue and appraise the value of the claim. So we actually have numbers. It actually makes it for when you actually go to trial. It doesn't leave the prices of certain things in the hands of a jury that may be relying on experts that might not exactly know the true price, versus an appraisal panel that really focuses in on that price. So there is not, in California, on a wildfire, appraisal is not mandatory. It can be requested, but there's no requirement that carriers go to it. So you can use that law, if it is a California loss, of course, against them to say, well, I don't have to go. I can reject your request for appraisal. Usually I see it's the other hand where the carrier is saying, we don't want to go to appraisal because they know once the appraisal process is completed, likely they're going to have to pay more money on a claim.
Thanks, Derek. Got one more question. I have a carrier refusing to pay for repainting the walls on a residential California wildfire claim, asserting that HEPA vacuuming is sufficient to restore the property. They acknowledge that leaving the walls unpainted would still expose the insured to VOCs, but argue that air quality is not a covered loss and therefore painting is not owed. Dan, can you?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the question, Michaela. So if we're talking about, purely VOCs and we're getting into, the scientific specificities of those, I'll leave that to Jonathan to follow up with. But certainly VOCs are one of several different types of things you want to test for. And we could be talking about a situation where there are VOCs and there are other detectable contaminants that are within the wall cavities of the home, right? Or they're embedded into the drywall, or, you know, into whatever your other wall covering materials might be. And so the question with painting can be encapsulation, right? It's a way to give a seal to prevent the recontamination from what's inside that can off gas out or breathe in and out through your walls. You can also have a situation where you can't, you damage the walls, right? Or they discolor, they get faded, something during the cleaning process. Because when you are cleaning smoke particulate, it's intensive, right? It's not just a simple microfiber, you know, super smooth wipe. It can cause damage. So, you know, there are, unfortunately, there are carriers who are just trying to minimize the scope of work and be cost effective here. And so there are only so far that carriers are going to offer when you first come out at the beginning. And you can only push them so far after that. They're going to draw the line eventually. And this may be one of those situations where it just needs to go to another level, where you need to break out of, you know, the constraints of just what the carrier wants to pay. But another way, hire someone like Jonathan, right? I mean, that's really the best thing that you can do, short of enforcing your rights through litigation, is hiring an expert and having that expert, you know, rebut what the insurance company says.
You know, I want to give just a warning. I mean, you know, it is tough for people, and the toughest claims we see after these wildfires, of course, are these wildfire particulate, smoke, soot, ash, lead, 17 panels of different metals, including lithium, beryllium, and even further air sampling testing showing cyanide. My heart goes out to these people because all they want to know is that their home is safe. But safety is not really something for, you know, an industrial hygienist to really say this is safe. That's really what a doctor's opinion should be doing. A doctor is one that says it's safe for that individual person to inhabit that home. So it's really complicated because, again, you can only do your best by collecting all the data you can, by hiring the experts to keep testing and keep finding these things. At the same time, if you're an attorney for someone representing that in this spot, they might not want to know what's in their property. Some people have pulled the plug. Some people have said, I want to leave this area. I'm not returning to this area. The insurance company has paid me some tiny amount to clean my home. I'm going to clean my home and cut my losses now, because they may owe a significant amount on their mortgage. They need to move along from their property. So that business decision really is a tough decision for the clients to make. And they should really be consulting, with realtors to make sure that they're not going to put themselves in a worse off condition. Because once you start testing and looking for these things, I know based on where the home is, generally what we're going to see based on the results of a bunch of other homes right around it with similar testing results. So it really is a tough decision for these people to be in, to decide how exactly they're going to proceed, because they might not want that testing. It's a double-edged sword. To be told that your house needs to be gutted down to the studs when you want to sell it is really not the information some people want to hear.
Thanks, Derek. We've got a follow-up question from Carrie. With these fires that burn lithium batteries in thousands of structures, habitability really should be the primary concern. How are the courts looking at this in recent cases? Dan?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So, you know, the comment of recent cases, right, is the reality is we have very limited case law on these issues, and not all of it is good. It's not that the case law is saying different than what we're saying, but the wrong factual scenarios have gone up to the courts, who make decisions that are binding on all the other courts. And so we have a really, really limited analysis here. We have a case called Caribbean, where the property owners had a light impact. They cleaned it up themselves. and they thought it was fine. But then lawyers came in and tested it and brought a case and pushed it. And the court held, right, well, because they could clean it up themselves and they testified that, everything was fine after, that was really the big issue. The case law that came before it that influenced this came out of the COVID-19 disputes about whether COVID-19 caused property damage. And a lot of health concerns were addressed in those cases. And there is some commentary in the cases about, the property being fit to live in, fit for its intended use. But we just don't have law right now from binding cases where we've had such a factual scenario where courts have really had an opportunity to weigh in on that. And I think that's because the insurance companies are settling a lot of those cases. They don't want them to become law. And so they're kind of controlling the narrative here. So separate from the law, though, it very much is important. Right? And if it's something, whatever is finding in your home, testing positive, if it's persistently there, it's not something that just dissipates over time. It's not something that you can just do your normal weekly cleaning and get rid of it, right? Then it's something that under the existing law should be covered. How much the health factor comes into play, especially in a scenario where you maybe have low amounts of certain things detected and there's no standards for what the cutoff is, but certainly in some degree, right, what you're finding there could be very harmful to your health. In cases where you're finding small amounts of that, but it potentially has this huge health impact, it's hard to say how the courts are going to treat that. I'm very cautious about it because these are property damage policies. So we'll see, Michael, we'll see. But when you hire someone like Jonathan and the testing results, are highly conclusive, then you've got a just case to pursue, right? There are plenty of unfortunate situations where people are on the borderline a little bit there, and we just don't know how those cases will shake out when push comes to shove.
Thanks, Dan.
Yep.
So we're going to wrap up, and if we can get a final thought from everybody. Derek, any final thoughts?
Definitely. I think you should be consulting an expert in this field. And 2 points. One, when you feel like something's going wrong, or when an insurance company says no to a reasonable request. It's, we usually see these issues around 8 months after a loss. On these wildfires, we were seeing it a lot earlier because insurance companies were dealing with changing law and really kind of trying to figure out what exactly their obligations were when the house is still standing. And unfortunately, they're not set up for massive amounts of claims like we're seeing. And that's why we're seeing, kind of inconsistency across the board. That's really the only consistency we've seen. And, a lot of times claims seem like they've been handled appropriately and properly. And on second look, they haven't. So just make sure you're doing a good job for your clients and making sure that, you're getting a second opinion if you do feel like something's missing or your client says something's missing.
Thanks, Derek. Dan? Dan, any final thoughts?
Okay, sorry, I was just getting unmuted there. My final thoughts are this area is so complicated and there are so many ways a claim can go wrong. And one of the best services we provide is saving people from making mistakes. Even the smartest people who are doing this for the first time are not going to figure everything out in time to handle a claim effectively. That's just the reality of it. And so, again, this seminar is mainly for personal attorneys. And in that context, right, buy yourself an insurance policy of your own as my recommendation. Don't try to handle a complex claim on your own. The insurance policy you buy is bringing in some folks like us, folks like Jonathan, whatever your situation calls for. That's the final thought you should take away. And I see a comment in the chat about, for the smoke claims especially, someone's noting turning to attorneys is maybe the only really way to get these done. And, unfortunately, we see that play out quite a bit. Whether or not that's the case or not, though, I would say it's a war of attrition. in order to get these things to a full resolution point. And the insurance company wins because folks can't wait that long, can't last that long, and they drop out of the process somewhere along the way. So don't wait too long, and don't wing it. Go with folks who have done this 1,000 times before.
Thanks, Dan. We saved the best for last. Jonathan, any final thoughts?
Oh, gentlemen, thank you for having me. I have to piggyback on Derek and Dan again, because I would say exactly what they said. I would maybe add, do it expeditiously, because you want to be able to prove your side of the loss as quickly as possible and submit that document. So now there's an official document on record that sets what your claim is about. And when they bring their expert in, they should be doing a proper peer review, which is an identical peer review to whether it's the building consultant or the engineer or the industrial hygienist, because you're ascertaining from the get-go and you're setting the bar. This is where the damages are that we've located. And then when they come in through the back end to verify, now you might have a little wiggle room to play with their experts and the directives that they're given. So get out in front of it quickly.
Thanks, Jonathan. Carrie, I see your question. We'll respond to you. I'll respond to you in a personal email on that question. I'd like to thank everybody for joining. You'll receive a referral roadmap and an expert selection guide. If you're handling an active claim or want a second opinion, reply to the follow-up email for a free Merlin triage call. Always remember, early involvement protects client outcomes and preserves claim value. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.